Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and absolutely thrilled to have back with me Brent Carlson and Mike Huneke. And we are going to take up one of the most talked about issues all the time in compliance, and that's the new ROI, but with a spin for export controls compliance. So, gentlemen, welcome back. And I can't think of a better topic to explore with both of you all. Brent, you want to set the stage for us?
Yeah, you bet. We've been talking to folks out there, and it's sort of a perennial issue across compliance functions, not only export controls, but we've seen it in the FCPA world as well, where compliance folks they struggle in their internal organizations trying to articulate a value proposition for investments in compliance. A lot of times, you have a lot of folks on the business side. They look at it as compliance as a cost center without a return, or they may be compliance is maybe viewed as a business blocker and not helping them to kind of get their deals done. But there's actually some ways if we kind of look and think about how that ROI, that return on investment in compliance is put together, there are ways that the compliance folks can articulate that and think about how they can position themselves within companies to get some traction and to get the message out up to the executive teams and the boards that even with just a little bit of investment up front, but focused on the right areas, it can go a long way to achieving clear and positive benefits.
Is there a problem, or do you hear problems raised about the cost benefit analysis in the world of export controls?
Tom, we do, and I think that we've heard anecdotally that in some cases, you're not talking about financial institutions who for decades have been very aware of sanctions risk, for example, and have spent a large amount of resources on staff and attention to these issues. Export controls today are capturing companies who may not be used to that type of environment or may think of this as more of an issue for the banks to deal with, and that the bank will tell me if I can't make a transaction, then I'll have to figure out something else. I think there's also, Tom, a bit of a legacy aftertaste, if you will, from an era where commerce, speaking of the Commerce Department, was there to promote commerce, and the primary function was commercial. Do what you can unless we tell you really can't do it. I think that approach still informs some legacy advisors' views. Give it a shot, even though technically what their clients may be proposing isn't legal. The enforcement risks are really low to their minds, and we're talking about small value figures. And yes, it's strict liability, but if it's strict liability on $30,000, to be really blunt, who cares? That is a massive miscalculation, Tom. It is true that if you look at what corporate enforcement actions have we seen to date, specifically speaking of commerce, if you talk about sanctions and OFAC, there's multi-billion dollar enforcement actions not that long ago. But we're talking about export controls and commerce. You have to go back to April of 2023 and the $300 million Seagate resolution to really find something that, from a historical FCPA perspective, might tip the needle. So I could see why people might have this misimpression.
And if I could add a couple of thoughts on that too, I mean, that's where some of this historical background with export controls has been, it's thrown this cost benefit analysis in terms of thinking about things from an ROI perspective out of whack. I mean, you look at the back, as Mike was saying, maybe had enforcement has been focused like not really on the big corporate cases, but other than Seagate from last April 2020, as far as that's been published, there's a perception that, yeah, that you couldn't just give it a shot. And a couple of examples where that may be where some folks may decide they're just not going to apply for a license at all, even though they think that maybe they should be in the case, or there may trigger effects that would point to that, leading one to do that. Or they may try to go with what are perceived loopholes in the export administration regulations. For example, it's like there's been a perception that, oh, shipping to a subsidiary is fine. It's not the listed entity itself, or there's a focus on perhaps the technical classification other than the catch-all end use and end user controls, which would trigger a license application requirement. So we're entering in a whole new field where that thinking has dominated a lot of kind of dynamics, but now there's a lot of other things coming into play that we'll get into here that are just upending that equation.
And Tom, I don't want to leave the misimpression that the Disruptive Technology Task Force hasn't been doing anything. They've actually been quite busy, although it's mostly been from what we've seen in public resolutions since, say, 2000, mid 2003, concerning the Russian intermediary in Brooklyn, for example, or the freight forwarding company that may have been involved. All the signs, Tom, are there, however, that there's about to be a significant reset of the cost benefit analysis that people might be undertaking. For example, in July of this year, the Commerce Department adopted in a very express way in its public guidance, the high probability standard that Brent and I have written about and that we've all talked about before. That's really been the driving force behind the last 2 decades of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement, because applying that standard, the government doesn't need to prove actual knowledge that something is definitely going to happen. They can just prove that you were aware of a high probability. What might put you on that high probability? The same guidance that the government's been issuing, especially in the last 2 years, about risks of diversion. As I've said a few times in a few different pods, they even use little red flags on the bullet points when they list these, for example. It's not just a public service that they're doing there. They're doing that to recalibrate people's awareness of probabilities. I'd also like to point out, Tom, there are new officials in the government from the Department of Justice in 2003, and then a year later in September 2024 in the Commerce Department, whose job title is to enforce the regulations against corporations, whether it's the chief of corporate enforcement or chief counsel of corporate enforcement. And talk about ROI, Tom, what are these guys' KPIs? Their KPIs are to bring cases against companies. So we expect them to do.
I'm going to ask you about the political aspect of this in terms of the change of administration, or maybe the opposite, administration agnostic, in a minute. But before we get there, can you point to other initiatives in the government, specifically anti-bribery, anti-corruption, that might be a parallel for export control?
Yeah, I can talk about. There's some interesting parallels if we look at between the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and where we're seeing export controls and sanctions today. In fact, the DOJ called export controls and sanctions the new FCPA, and I think a lot of folks were kind of scratching their head, wondering what exactly all that meant. But in some ways, we can let's look at the historical evolution and those parallels there. The FCPA was a sleeper law and a sleepy area of compliance until it wasn't. It was passed in the late '70s. It went along until you got the early 2000s, and then it took off like a rocket. So once you saw the enforcement priority and the penalties rise, then you saw management teams and boards of directors, they saw that cost benefit analysis in terms of putting in a compliance program totally change. And so it was well worth the effort. If we look at penalties for export controls violations, they're still quite low compared with those with the FCPA. And Mike and I did an article last year about where we compared the top 10 penalties in the FCPA or the top 10 penalties with export administration regulations, and they don't compare. And you can find that on our Fresh Looks piece. It's I call it From Peanuts to Prison Time. But what we're seeing now is we're on the edge now with these geopolitical drivers and the domestic political reactions and interactions with those geopolitical drivers. Export control penalties are now at a tipping point. And the signals that Mike we're talking about, combined with the increasing gale force geopolitical tailwinds, is kind of pushing this whole situation to what I call a Star Trek moment. I mean, so it's going to boldly go where no one has gone before. And really what's driving it are national security priorities. I mean, what folks are looking at, a lot of business people are looking at in the incoming administration, they'll be more business friendly. And yes, that's true. But it also is going to be very focused on national security priorities, and those national security priorities are going to trump those other issues. And so that's going to push the export controls far beyond the SCPA experience.
Brent, can you take us back to the first Trump administration and what you and Mike both saw in that, and maybe use that as some guidance for what you may expect in this second administration?
Yeah, you bet. Buckle up. There's going to be a lot more of the same. So it was the first Trump administration called it. I mean, in the sense where it's like there were imbalances in the trade relationship with China. And there were issues too of you had theft of intellectual property and fundamentally unfair trade practices. And so those are being addressed. Those are being totally addressed. And so now you look at what's very interesting. You saw that in the first Trump administration, tariffs were put in place. You saw prominent PRC companies get put on the entity list. You saw that uptick in the focus on export controls. Those are all carried over into the Biden administration and continued. And now we're where we are today. The situation, the U.S.-China relations are not getting any better, and probably they're not going to get any better for the foreseeable future. I mean, hopefully they do. And I believe over the long term, we'll get to the same place. But just looking at reality in the short term, it's going to be a bumpy ride. So you look at, there's going to be issues on, again, driven by national security priorities.
Yeah. And maybe
Mike,
Tom,
from
oh, sorry,
yeah, I
Tom.
wanted yeah, from your perspective, Mike, how do you see this is not only driven by geopolitics, but really as a manifestation of the popular will of the people of the United States?
That's a heavy question, Tom. Yeah, I don't purport to speak for all of the people, but my sense is that what really motivated a lot of voters were, in some cases, some very single issue politic driven minds, right? That whatever else was being said, there were issue where, that was going to determine what they voted. Um, but something that actually seemed to be bipartisan and again, fairly or not, was this idea that China was taking advantage of the United States and that all of these things America had done to promote free trade were done in a situation where we were the only ones engaging in free trade and that our trading partners were engaging in currency manipulation, market manipulation that really took advantage of our willingness to be free. If you've read, Tom, or if anyone listening has read Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, this is the playbook that not only was applied, and Lighthizer was the U.S. trade representative in the first Trump administration. He talks in great detail about the playbook for negotiating against China in the first administration. He talks about how that playbook was followed in the Biden administration. And there's a lot of unfinished business from his perspective for the second Trump administration. I've been a bit surprised that Lighthizer hasn't been appointed or at least announced as an appointee to any high level position, but many of the people, especially dealing with Treasury and Commerce, are generally expected to follow these same lines. Some of them have some prior China business dealings themselves. And so it's a bit of an open question whether that will make them more sympathetic to China or make them more aggressive about it, depending on how they feel that's gone. But I think the incoming administration will feel very strongly that there is a powerful mandate for being aggressive with China.
And if
Mike,
I'm, oh, good. I was just going
go ahead, Brent.
I was just going to just a little bit more to that, because I think this is a huge topic that's worth unpacking a bit. This could be a whole series of podcasts, but I think we won't go there today, but it's important to understand that background context where the whole international trade order post World War II, based on the Bretton Woods Accord, is completely changing. That's been upended. China was the last, if you look at where China's economy followed over the last several decades, it followed where you had Japan and the Four Tigers go. You had, which was the US was supporting those economies to export-led growth to rebuild from World War II. Starting with Japan, you had Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. China then was the last player into that game, but they were on a scale way beyond those Four Tigers ever were. And they never were, and what the dynamic here is that they never were a close ally of the United States. They were partners, and definitely you had when President Nixon went to China and developed that new accord, there was an understanding of a mutually beneficial relationship there. But that then sucked in, that brought in China as like this, it opened the door for China's development for foreign companies to go in and invest and manufacture the things there, and for China to become the workshop of the world. Now, geopolitics have caught up with us, and we're sort of in this weird phase where we've got economic value supply chains and whole value chains that are crossing these geopolitical fault lines that have been unresolved. And now we're dealing with them. And that's one thing I think to keep in mind as all this comes together. because I saw it. You go, Mr. Lighthizer, Bob Lighthizer, when he wrote his book, he was a attorney, came out of Ohio. He saw the deindustrialization of Ohio and what it did. And those are creating huge political and domestic U.S. pressures to address these issues geopolitically. So I think it's important to kind of put that into context to kind of understand where things are going as well.
Mike, if I could ask you, so I come out of the energy industry, and there was certain that sort of, I don't want to call it grassroots because it was corporate, but corporate understanding and corporate desires to level up somehow the playing field, even if it meant adding a round of sanctions and or export controls. But many people now see this directly as a national security issue. Could you maybe draw that line for us from what I saw or Lighthouser saw in the manufacturing industry or what I saw in the energy industry to the view today that this is really a national security issue?
Sure, Tom. We're seeing a lot of things being swept into the national security tent. Economic security is being equated to national security, especially when you're talking about whether they're facing threats or challenges or outright adversaries, countries against which we really don't have a palatable military option. I don't think anyone thinks that war with another nuclear power is a great idea or something to jump to quickly. So what that leaves us with are some least worst alternatives, all of which are have limitations and are challenging. But nothing to me illustrates the national security implications of export controls on commerce than what we saw yesterday. We're recording this on December 17th. On December 16th, the US government announced the arrest of two nationals for exporting items and technology through Switzerland to Iran that were used in drones that killed three US service members in Jordan earlier this year. These things are dual use because they can kill people. And that's why we're concerned about them. It, that type of tragedy and that type of event that really, in my view, will make not only has made the current administration, but will make the incoming administration even more non-receptive to arguments about it's difficult or we can't do everything or we can't go too far down the distributor or reseller supply chain. If you look at Congress in the middle of all, this is the bipartisan issue in Congress is the trade imbalance, the economic competition with China. We've seen in this current Congress that's just concluding already an aggressive tone, posture, position vis-a-vis exporting or even design companies, whether things are made overseas. Everything we're hearing, reading, anticipating is that the incoming Congress is going to be even more aggressive. When you tie this back to funding and taxpayer support as well, one of the reasons that compliance has I'd say, increased ROI in this current environment is that I think Congress and the agencies are going to put increasing pressure on companies who receive, whether it's CHIPS Act or other types of federal support, to defend the line drawing that they're doing about their current business in China. And to be able to draw those lines, you have to take a very, open-eyed view of not only the risks that you're facing of diversion or evasion, whether to or through China, but what kind of inputs are you going to rely upon to draw those lines? If any of us call up someone on floor 37B of a high rise in Hong Kong and say, would you sign a second in use certificate? We will get a second in use certificate. We could get 10 of them if we wanted to. So it's what is a good input. It's something Brent and I have written on in our Fresh Look series, but it requires really to step back and look holistically. What trade flows did we have before certain controls or restrictions were put in place? When those restrictions were put in place, what happened? Did we lose that business or did suddenly a white knight customer appear willing to fill the void? And if that latter thing happened, how good do we feel about that being legitimate? What kind of controls are we putting on there? That comes back all the way, Tom, to the high probability standard. That's the type of analysis that standard invites and welcomes companies to apply. And that certainly at DOJ, from our experience with the FCPA, but also at Commerce, based on discussions with them, certainly those agencies should be at least open to those types of discussions.
We've spent about 20 minutes going through a series of issues, problems, and conundrums for U.S. businesses. Can I maybe ask you, what do you see as the solution?
Yeah, you bet. I think there's two parts to it. And one is sort of a macro level thinking, one's sort of a micro level thinking on where the impact of the macro hits the deck for the company at the micro version. And the first one is I think the companies need to be thinking about what are the real risks related to China? What's their exposure on that? I think the COVID experience and the supply chain disruptions that we had are a great preview of what could be coming down the pike. Here's the thing, we live in an era defined by uncertainty. Will it happen? We don't know. What's the likelihood? We can take a best guess, but you can't totally ignore it. And you got to be kind of thinking about what are the contingencies? What are the plans that the company will do in the case that you've got some exposure to China that just comes back or it just blows up. On Apollo's side, also going back to the macros piece again, he is also looking at where the next wave of investment are going to go. If you're looking at that global world trade order is reconfiguring, there are going to be new opportunities in new markets as you have these sort of trading partners reconfigure. So that's one thing to think about from the business development perspective is start focusing on that. And then that then gets down to to kind of the details and thinking about what should we be doing for export controls specifically now at this moment, and start with incremental risk-based and pragmatic steps. Start with applying that high probability standard. If the board hasn't gotten a report on their export controls program and there's no report of the high probability standard, there's no mention at all, especially over the course of this year and the signals coming out of government, that's something that needs to be addressed. Start with the audits, start with them and focused where the risks are. So you don't want anything to be a mile wide and an inch deep. Where are the risks going to be? Like we're getting all kinds of signals that are coming out of the government from Congress that diversion is the risk. So how to best address those through those focused audits that Mike and I talk about in a recent press release article.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
Tom, let's just step back and maybe summarize for the listeners coming back to the ROI. What are the ways that they can better articulate the real ROI for export controls compliance, whether it's to their management, whether it's to the board, whoever the stakeholders might be? One aspect of that is the ability to mitigate your enforcement risk and avoid penalties. It's not just avoiding the penalties, it's avoiding the cost, it's avoiding the disruption, it's avoiding the reputational risk should an investigation of your company become public. Even if you have an administrative subpoena in hand and it's not yet public, remember there's a task force between BIS and DOJ. They're communicating all the time on these topics. Second, I think there's a very much underappreciated risk of whistleblowers in this space. In the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act space, whistleblowers is a topic I've heard you talk about many times, and it's very much front of mind for people. I don't think people realize that part of the DOJ gap filling exercise that they have done in the so-called policy sprint this year on these topics was in part meant to fill the gap on export controls. You had an amendment to FinCEN's whistleblower program, which historically had been focused on Bank Secrecy Act violations, that allowed a couple years ago for IEPA-based offenses to be part of that. But not every export control is actually IEPA-based in terms of its authorities. Some are statutory, passed by Congress. So there is a bit of a gap filling that I think DOJ thinks has already happened. And anecdotally, I wouldn't be surprised if there's already some whistleblowers in the door represented and providing detailed information to the DOJ. The best way to deal with whistleblowers is to, well, first, don't cause people to be them. If people are raising concerns, be respectful of those concerns, ensure that they aren't retaliated against, and communicate with them as best you're able in a good faith way about the process you're going through to evaluate their allegations. Plenty of times people hear things and misunderstand them. I have one case, Tom, and I won't name any names, but someone thought a cash bribe payment was made in front of them, and it was a payment for a used car that was in the parking lot. People are limited in what they can understand about what's going on without further inquiry. It doesn't mean that every whistleblower allegation ends up being what the whistleblower thinks it is. But if you handle whistleblowers in a way that's respectful and is non-retaliatory, I think you'll have a better culture and a better environment on top of that. And I think the other part of the ROI is I think companies are going to have to fight hard if they're receiving federal government support in the US to defend any ongoing business in China under the current incoming administration. So doing these types of compliance investments now, showing that beyond some of the requests that have come out of the political hearings in Congress that may not make any sense, you're taking a very level-headed approach. You're relying on valuable and reliable inputs to make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing in China is essential to not even necessarily protecting the ongoing business in China, but to protecting your company's ability to continue receiving support from the US government, whether we're talking about defense contracts or just other incentives available to any manufacturers or exporters. And then, Tom, I'd say the other point to make is that if people are not getting buy-in from their boards of directors, if you're exporting at all, especially if you're exporting to China, the recent Delaware cases that the three of us discussed in the prior podcast about the Caremark standard and how that's evolved, export controls is a central compliance risk for companies that depend on exports. And you need to do a little bit more than just ask management, hey, are we on top of this? And hear them say, yes, sure we are. To what Brent just said, you need to be asking them, okay, how did we react to this new emphasis on the high probability standard? And what are we doing to make sure we are protected under that standard? What opportunities does that standard present to us?
I want to end by asking what I think is an incredibly straightforward question, but you may disagree. Because early on, when we were talking about specifically the high probability standard, I think, Brent, it was you, but maybe Mike said, part of the information about high probability comes from government issued guidance and documents. And am I hearing incredibly circular prosecutorial argument that we have told you what the high probabilities are? It's in the public record. You now know it. And guess what? We're going to prosecute you if you didn't consider what we told you. Is it that simple or is it more sophisticated than that?
I think it's even simpler. I don't think the government, Tom, would even call it circular, right?
Straight line? Right.
Yeah, it is a straight and in some ways unfair line. It's the same governance issue that we see in the FCPA space, where this is not court-made law. This is not congressional enacted law. This is prosecutorial common law established through settlements. And we're already starting to see it. Although the settlement figures haven't been big in terms of fines. In August, we saw the TE connectivity settlement with BIS. What did that look like? Voluntary cooperation and a reward for doing that. We saw the Global Foundries resolution a month or so later, maybe 2 months later. What do we see there? Exceptional cooperation, mitigated penalty amounts. All of these are signals that if you come in and cooperate, you can pay less. And by the way, what do those cases do? They talk about the red flags. They talk about the risks people were aware of. The TE connectivity case in particular goes out of its way. You might even say bend over backwards, depending on how you read it, to insert the high probability standard throughout. Now that's in the law. It's in the regs. It has been since 1996. But I have no doubt that from the perspective of the Commerce Department and the disruptive technology strike force it has with DOJ, they've been exceedingly clear and patient. If you look at every guidance, whether it's the Iran ballistic missile program, the Iran UAV program, Russia, maritime shipping, freight forwarding, all of these guidance documents in the last 2 years have been either issued or updated to emphasize high probability red flags. It's coming, Tom.
Brent, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world of uncertainty and change. And all that said, the trend is our friend. The trends are clear, but we'll look at where those trends are, and you'll see some past ways. Every business changes. Any business that relies on its old business model, like for past success, they go, if Ford Motor were still building a Model T, maybe they'll have a small group of collectors buy it, but it ain't going to be to scale. So look at how these trends are playing out. and then get in front of it, get in there, and there will be new opportunities for growth for businesses in this environment. It's just that you don't want to be fighting the last war. You want to be looking forward to the new opportunities up ahead. And that's where thinking about export controls and the ROI analysis in that really comes into play, because having a good export controls compliance program can open those doors for those new opportunities more than ever before.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time for this episode. I greatly look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure.
It's, likewise.